In the land of crowns, castles, and centuries of stiff upper lips, the weirdest royal rumors were always whispered, never believed. Until they turned out to be true. From teddy bear armies to secret gin and teacups, these aren't scandals. They're the gloriously petty, bizarre, and jaw-droppingly real quirks the palace never wanted in the press. You thought the monarchy was all tradition and tiaras? Think again. These are the 33 dumbest British royal rumors that sounded too ridiculous to be real, but somehow were. And yes, someone really did climb a tree in full royal regalia. Let's begin. Before we dive in, if you love strange true stories, royal weirdness, and the kind of rumors that make you say, "Wait, seriously?" Go ahead and subscribe. We've got plenty more where this came from. And while you're here, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Midnight in Manchester? 3 a.m. in Toronto? We want to know who's staying up late for this royal chaos. 1. Queen Anne really did keep dozens of tiny dogs around her bed. It sounds like something out of a deranged children's book. A lonely queen, tucked into bed in her royal nightgown, surrounded not by courtiers or noble advisors, but by a yipping, squirming constellation of spaniels. Dozens of them, nestled like hot coals in velvet cushions. The rumor at the time, that Queen Anne of Great Britain, sovereign of a nation, slept barricaded by toy dogs. A canine fortress, a barking battlement. The whispers were relentless. Political cartoons showed her bed as a kind of kennel. Satirists nicknamed her bedroom the Kennel Chamber. Even her political rivals mocked the court as the House of Bark. Everyone assumed it was exaggerated gossip, a metaphor for weakness, a jab at femininity, a crude joke about indulgence. After all, monarchs were supposed to be surrounded by guards, not spaniels. But here's the annoying part about history. Sometimes it confirms the dumbest possible version of the story. When letters from Anne's ladies-in-waiting resurfaced centuries later, they confirmed what was once deemed absurd. The Queen's bedchamber truly did resemble a petting zoo for the aristocratically fluffy. Multiple courtiers independently described the same image. Anne surrounded by a churning sea of toy spaniels, sometimes so many that they had to be swept off the bed just for the Queen to lie down. There were lapdogs curled beneath the sheets, dogs resting on velvet footstools, dogs tucked into quilts. One visitor even described the room as smelling thickly of dog powder and royal sweat. Anne didn't just tolerate them, she adored them. Each had a name, a ribbon, and its own assigned spot. And if one of them barked during a diplomatic conversation, Anne didn't mind. In fact, she sometimes barked back. It's tempting to read this through the lens of eccentricity, or even loneliness. Anne endured 17 pregnancies, none of which resulted in a surviving heir. She buried every one of her children. In the face of that kind of loss, maybe the soft comfort of a loyal, wriggling creature meant more than protocol could ever provide. Maybe the yapping wasn't a nuisance. Maybe it was the only sound in the palace that didn't remind her of death. But history rarely allows sentiment without irony. The woman mocked for being surrounded by spaniels would become the last monarch of the House of Stuart, her reign ending not with a scandal, but with a litter of barking loyalties and no direct successor. The crown passed on, but the image of the Queen in her bed, flanked by dozens of tiny dogs like a fairy tale witch or a spoiled heiress, has survived centuries of wars, revolutions, and political upheavals. And honestly, compared to what came next, it's practically wholesome. Because what if I told you the next king didn't just surround himself with trees? He climbed them in full royal garb at age 60, and no one could stop him. 2. George II truly loved climbing trees at age 60 plus. It's one thing to feel a childlike connection to nature. It's another to be a 60-year-old king of Great Britain. responsible for managing wars, diplomacy, and the fragile ego of the English Parliament, and still sneak away to climb trees like a schoolboy dodging chores. That was the rumor about George II, a whisper that began as idle court gossip. The aging monarch would wander into the gardens at Kensington Palace and vanish among the oaks. Some said he just liked the fresh air. Others said he was hiding from his ministers. But the strangest story persisted. The king wasn't just walking in the gardens. He was climbing the trees. At the time, the idea was laughed off. A monarch dressed in full 18th century finery, scaling branches like a cat with a deadline? Absurd. Clearly satire. The kind of thing you'd see in a Punch cartoon with oversized wigs and ridiculous trousers. People dismissed it as political mockery, yet another jab at the Hanoverian king who, to many of his critics, was too German, too distant, too undignified. But like so many rumors about British royals, this one refused to die. And over time, it began to gain uncomfortable confirmation. Several courtiers, in letters and private journals, made offhand references to His Majesty's woodland habits. A French envoy described the king's curious fondness for the upper limbs of trees. And then there was Horace Walpole, that delightfully gossipy writer and politician, who matter-of-factly mentioned that the king had once been spotted perched rather indecorously above the gardens. Indecorously being 18th century code for, what the hell is he doing up there? The details that emerged over time only made the story weirder. George II didn't just wander into the garden and clamber onto a stump. No, he had favorite trees. Oaks he returned to regularly. And while the image of a monarch pulling himself up by the branches may seem farcical, it's not impossible. George was known for being unusually spry for his age. He walked quickly, had a fierce temper, and detested sitting still. He was also famously stubborn, which, in royal terms, often means doing something absolutely ridiculous just because no one can tell you not to. Some accounts claim he was trying to escape the stifling boredom of court life. Others speculate he simply liked the solitude, the view, or the thrill. But perhaps the strangest theory comes from a now-lost letter referenced in a later biography, one that claimed George believed the trees helped him hear himself think. Not the worst therapy plan if you're a 60-year-old man who's spent his life surrounded by flattery, lies, and powdered wigs. Still, you have to wonder what the gardeners thought. Walking out in the early morning with pruning shears, only to spot the King of England hanging upside down from a branch like an elderly bat. And yet, for all its absurdity, there's something oddly human about it. Maybe this was how George II coped with the weight of monarchy, by pretending for a few quiet minutes that he wasn't wearing a crown at all. Just leaves and wind and the creaking of old bark. A brief return to boyhood in the most literal way possible. But if you thought that was a strange way to bond with nature, wait until you meet his son. George III didn't climb trees. He talked to them. He held full-blown conversations, with oaks no less. And in one deeply awkward case, he thought he was speaking to the King of Prussia. If you're enjoying this very regal descent into absurdity, make sure to subscribe, because there's a lot more royal nonsense where that came from. And while George II was busy tree climbing at 60, you're watching YouTube. So tell us, where are you tuning in from, and what time is it right now? Are you horizontal on a couch in Melbourne at 2 a.m., half-dressed in Oslo at lunch? We're dying to know. 3. George III talked to his favorite oak tree, believing it was the King of Prussia. There are eccentricities, and then there's mistaking an oak tree for a head of state. By the time George III's mental health became the subject of medical inquiry, political satire, and unfortunate stage plays, the public had already long whispered about the king's increasingly erratic behavior. Some thought it was stress. Others blamed inbreeding. But perhaps the strangest, and, for years, most ridiculed, rumor was this. George III, in the garden at Kew, had not only spoken aloud to an oak tree, but had addressed it formally, believing it to be none other than Frederick the Great, King of Prussia. Now, let's take a breath and appreciate just how bizarre this rumor sounded when it first emerged. This wasn't a vague claim that he liked nature or spent too much time outdoors. This was a specific account that, according to gossip, he bowed to a tree, introduced himself, and engaged in a diplomatic conversation with it. Allegedly, he even used the full royal titles. To an oak. While his startled aides looked on in silence, unsure whether to interrupt or water it. Naturally, it became a favorite punchline among the British elite. The Whigs joked about it. French cartoonists ran wild with it. Some even drew George shaking hands with a tree in full military uniform. The assumption was simple. This was slander, satirical nonsense, a tragic exaggeration of a monarch who was certainly unwell, but surely not that far gone. But unfortunately for royal dignity, and fortunately for historians, the documents began to stack up. Private journals, letters from household staff, even medical notes from his long-suffering physicians. While the exact identity of the tree, whether it was truly meant to be the King of Prussia, remains a little fuzzy, the fact that George III regularly addressed trees as if they were people, that part is confirmed. More than one observer at Kew noted that the king often wandered the gardens in deep conversation, with no one else present. He was said to speak clearly, politely, sometimes even laughing at responses that only he could hear. One report mentions him scolding a particular oak for its indecision. Another notes him gesturing upward, as if offering terms of alliance to a particularly high branch. This wasn't a one-time episode. It was a ritual. A relationship. Some might say, diplomacy. And what's especially strange is that the King of Prussia, Frederick the Great, had been a long-time political and military figure of importance to George. They'd corresponded in earlier decades. They'd shared enemies, occasionally flattered one another, and maintained a tense respect. If George's mind was reaching for familiar anchors in a sea of confusion, Frederick, strong, distant, and symbolic, would have made sense, even if he now had bark and leaves. There's also a bitter irony here. George III is remembered in part for losing the American colonies, for failing to keep a sprawling, chaotic empire together. And yet, in his moments of personal unraveling, he imagined himself negotiating, still trying to hold on to diplomacy, still conducting royal duties, even if his only audience had roots in squirrels. By the time the court doctors began documenting his episodes in full, the damage was done. The rumor had gone from satire to history. He really did talk to trees. He really did believe they could talk back. But the irony isn't quite finished. Because while George III believed a tree was a king, the next royal queen was hiding something too. Not in the garden, not in the mind, but under her corset, something grotesquely real, padded into silence for decades. 4. Queen Caroline of Ansbach secretly wore a massive corset to hide an umbilical hernia. For centuries, royal fashion has been used to disguise everything from scandalous affairs to unflattering silhouettes to monarchs who simply refused to age gracefully. But few royal illusions were as whispered about or as brutally mocked as the rumor surrounding Queen Caroline of Ansbach. That beneath her silks and jewels, beneath the stiff etiquette of the Georgian court, she was hiding a massive medical secret. The story went like this. Caroline, wife of George II, had an unnaturally round midsection. Not queenly, not fashionable, not pleasingly plump, but suspiciously, inexplicably shaped. People murmured about it during balls, whispered in palace corridors, and speculated in newspapers written by men who couldn't sew a button but felt fully qualified to diagnose royalty from afar. The rumor claimed she wore a heavily reinforced corset, far tighter and far larger than any lady of the time, to conceal something abnormal. Exactly what, no one could decide. Too many pregnancies? A strange swelling? A foreign growth? Theories grew like weeds. Every dress she wore seemed to amplify the suspicion. Every portrait painted of her rounded midsection became fuel for louder jokes. And because this was the early 18th century, nuance was not a cultural priority. People didn't ask whether the queen might be ill or uncomfortable. No. Caroline's shape became comic fodder, easy satire, and a handy excuse for political opponents to depict her as grotesque or vain or both. But the truth, when it finally emerged, was not funny at all. It was painfully human, quietly tragic, and a reminder that royal dignity often masks ordinary suffering. Caroline had developed a severe umbilical hernia, likely after multiple pregnancies, so pronounced that her physicians designed a custom, near-armor-like corset to hold it in place. It wasn't decorative. It wasn't vanity. It was medical necessity. The alternative would have been constant pain, dangerous swelling, and the potential for internal damage. But medical privacy didn't exist for queens. Her corset became a secret she had to carry daily. And so she mastered the royal trick. Stand tall, smile gracefully, and pretend the whispers don't exist. For years, her ladies-in-waiting protected her. Her dressmakers adjusted patterns, and her portraits were politely edited. Meanwhile, gossips chattered about her strange shape, as if bodies are meant to be symmetrical, silent, and obedient. When she died, doctors finally confirmed what no one outside her intimate circle had understood. The rumor was not only true, but understated. Her condition had grown severe. The corset had been doing the work of both fashion and medicine, keeping her mobile, composed, regal. What the public mocked as vanity was actually survival. And in a way, the discovery made the rumor even stranger, because, while Caroline had been hiding something real beneath her clothing, her son, the future George IV, would spend his life inventing things to hide on his body. Not medical necessities, not tragic secrets. No, he built illusions for one reason only, to look dramatically thinner than he was. Which brings us to the next rumor. The king who padded his legs, yes, padded, to appear more slender. A body modified not by necessity, but by royal-level insecurity. 5. George IV padded his legs so he'd look thinner. Before Photoshop, there was tailoring. And before Instagram filters, there was vanity. High-born, silk-stitched, perfumed insecurity stitched directly into your trousers. No monarch embodied this ancient art of visual deception more spectacularly than George IV, the prince regent turned king who was, in many ways, more costume than character. The rumor that dogged George throughout his reign was almost too ridiculous to take seriously, that he padded his calves. Not to add bulk, but to reshape his legs entirely. Specifically, that beneath his immaculate stockings and bespoke breeches, he wore carefully crafted calf enhancers, soft, sculpted inserts that gave the illusion of a lithe, athletic build, a fashionable lie strapped on daily, like a royal prosthetic for wounded pride. At first, the story was dismissed as satirical slander. George was already a favorite target for caricaturists, who gleefully exaggerated his waistline, powdered jowls, and flamboyant lifestyle. Making fun of his fashion choices was practically a national pastime. But calf padding? That felt like a stretch, even for a king whose reputation for self-indulgence had eclipsed his actual reign. And yet, as the documents began to accumulate, receipts, inventories, tailor's notes, even letters from palace staff, it became harder and harder to deny. George IV didn't just wear extravagant clothing. He engineered it, with precision, with obsession, and yes, with padding. His tailors were sworn to discretion, but not all of them went to their graves silently. One mentioned calf boosters that had to be readjusted depending on the formality of the event. Another referenced a particular pair of evening trousers that had to be let out at the waist and stuffed at the leg to restore balance. When the royal wardrobe was finally inventoried after his death, the absurd truth was laid bare. The man had a small library of artificial enhancements for his legs. Not prosthetics, not braces, just aesthetic lies made from velvet and stuffing. Why go to such lengths? Quite literally, to maintain the illusion of elegance. In the fashion of the time, strong calves were considered an emblem of manliness, especially among military leaders and monarchs. George, who had once been relatively slender, found his body betraying him as he aged and overindulged in the pleasures of court life. Rather than accept the change, he fought it with fabric. It wasn't just about looking good. It was about looking correct, proper, idealized. Monarchs weren't supposed to age like commoners. Their bodies, like their power, were meant to be eternal. So George faked it, softly, subtly, daily. The king's vanity became its own costume, his calves a lie told in cotton and thread. And the most ironic part? Most people probably didn't notice. His portraits were flattering. His public appearances were theatrical. His critics focused on bigger targets, his spending, his political meddling, his waistline. But beneath all the extravagance, beneath the polished boots and formal bows, there were fake calves keeping up appearances. Because being king wasn't about honesty, it was about silhouette. Of course, George wasn't finished with the tailoring tricks, because as it turns out, his obsession with appearing slim didn't stop at his legs. He took it a step further, or rather, a few painful inches tighter. Yes, the next royal rumor was about his corset, and not just wearing one, but wearing it so tightly, he reportedly fainted at the dinner table. 6. George IV also wore a corset so tight he fainted at dinner parties. Vanity, for most people, comes and goes with the lighting. For George IV, it was stitched into every breath, literally. If his padded calves weren't enough to maintain the illusion of aristocratic elegance, the next layer of deception sat a little higher, tightly wound around his torso, every inch drawn in with military precision. The rumor? That George IV wore a corset, not for posture, not for health, but to squeeze his increasingly indulgent figure into the silhouette of a slimmer man. And not just any corset, a brutally tight one. So tight, in fact, that it was said to cause him to faint, mid-conversation, mid-toast, mid-dinner. The kind of dramatic collapse that would send a ripple of confusion across a ballroom until someone helpfully pointed out, it's just the king's corset again. At the time, this rumor was easy to dismiss. Yes, men of the Regency era occasionally wore stays, light undergarments for posture or uniformed elegance. But fainting from tight lacing? That was a trope reserved for Victorian women in novels clutching their pearls. Surely no king, no manly monarch, would compromise his ability to breathe just to maintain the illusion of a narrow waistline. That would be absurd, feminine, embarrassing, unthinkable. And yet, it was true. Taylor records, private letters, and gossip from the royal household eventually painted a very firm, very compressed picture. George IV had his corsets custom-made, imported from Paris, and reinforced with steel boning. These weren't dainty garments. They were architectural undertakings, necessary, perhaps, to contain a figure that had, by the later years of his reign, ballooned well past the limits of discretion. But rather than dress for comfort or honesty, George escalated. His corsets grew tighter, his fainting spells more frequent. At one especially infamous dinner, he was said to have gone completely silent mid-course, then slid gently off his chair to the floor, startling guests and causing a footman to drop an entire silver platter. The official explanation? Exhaustion. But the court knew better. The king had laced himself into unconsciousness again. Why go to such extremes? Because George IV didn't merely want to appear slim, he needed to project an image. He was a king in an age of optics. His reign was turbulent, his public reputation fragile, and his personal life riddled with failures. Fashion was control. Appearances were power. And the corset, this quiet little vice under layers of brocade, was his last stand against the humiliations of reality. There's something grimly poetic about it, a monarch literally squeezing himself into a fantasy, breathing shallowly to keep up a lie. collapsing under the weight of his own illusion, but insisting it be laced tighter the next day. No one could stop him. He was the king. He could barely inhale, but by God, he looked presentable. And if you think that's excessive, wait until you hear about his mother-in-law. Because the next royal rumor wasn't about vanity or tight trousers. It was about something even more peculiar, something feathered, caged, and very much alive. Yes, Queen Charlotte supposedly kept a secret zoo in her private apartments. And as silly as that sounds, it wasn't a joke. 7. Queen Charlotte kept a secret zoo in her apartments at Kew. In the long, candlelit corridors of Kew Palace, among the formal tapestries and stiff royal portraits, a different kind of kingdom once thrived, one that squawked, chattered, and occasionally flung things. The rumor? That Queen Charlotte, wife of George III, kept a secret zoo in her private chambers. Not a royal menagerie in the formal sense, with penned deer or exotic beasts in distant gardens. No, this was more intimate, more chaotic, and much, much weirder. At first, the story played like an upper-class joke. Royal consorts were often accused of eccentricity, too many perfumes, too many shawls, too many opinions. The idea that Queen Charlotte had transformed part of her royal suite into a jungle of parrots, monkeys, and bizarre birds seemed to her critics like perfect fodder. A foreign queen with foreign habits importing creatures no self-respecting British monarch would tolerate indoors. Tabloids of the day leaned into it with glee. The rumors claimed you could hear tropical screeches echoing down the palace halls, that dinner guests were occasionally startled by a monkey on a windowsill, and that foreign diplomats were once met not by a footman, but by a particularly loud toucan. Everyone assumed it was a smear, a cartoon exaggeration, a dig at her German heritage or her supposed aloofness. No one actually believed the Queen kept a full-blown feathered circus in her living quarters. And yet, the documents say otherwise. Letters from court ladies and visiting dignitaries slowly chipped away at the disbelief. One Dutch ambassador mentioned that the Queen's drawing room contained more living creatures than furniture. A German visitor described a monkey seated on a velvet stool eyeing guests as though it were judging them. And most damning of all, household logs from Kew Palace included budget entries for exotic feed, birdcage repairs, and a rather ominous line item simply labeled replacement drapes, parrot damage. This wasn't a rumor. It was a reality. Charlotte, it turns out, had a deep fascination with animals, particularly those that defied British norms. Parrots that mimicked court gossip, finches that chirped through state meetings, and yes, monkeys that were reportedly allowed to roam freely when the Queen was in a certain mood. Some were gifts from foreign envoys. Others were purchased, much to the dismay of her staff. But all of them found a strange kind of sanctuary in her private apartments, turning a royal suite into something between a greenhouse and a comedy sketch. Why keep such a menagerie indoors? Some say Charlotte found comfort in their presence, liveliness in a palace known for its political coldness. Others think it was a small rebellion against the rigid etiquette of court life. When your days are filled with bows, curtsies, and endless social performance, maybe a screaming parrot and a climbing monkey are the only honest creatures in the room. And of course, in true royal fashion, it wasn't officially acknowledged. The zoo remained undocumented in formal records, invisible in portraits, and absolutely off-limits to the press. But the royal tradition of odd behavior didn't stop there, because if Queen Charlotte's scandal involved monkeys, her son-in-law's scandal involved vocabulary. Very loud, very inappropriate vocabulary. The next royal secret? A king who swore so often and so colorfully, even at children, that his letters had to be censored. 8. William IV swore constantly, even at children. Before Queen Victoria ushered in the prim, pearl-clutching morality of the 19th century, the British throne was briefly occupied by a man who made sailors blush. Literally. William IV, affectionately nicknamed the Sailor King, spent most of his early life in the Royal Navy, before becoming king almost by accident. He wasn't supposed to rule, and frankly, by the time he did, he made no effort to pretend he was cut from royal cloth. The rumor that followed him, whispered in drawing rooms, muttered by scandalized governesses, and repeated gleefully by children, was that William IV swore constantly. Not in private, not under his breath, but publicly, loudly, and with stunning creativity. And not just at politicians or misbehaving servants. No, William reportedly cursed in front of, and occasionally at, children. When the stories began circulating, many assumed this was political mudslinging. He was a blunt monarch, unpolished and unpretentious, which made him an easy target. Satirists painted him as uncouth. Aristocrats dismissed him as embarrassingly common. His salty vocabulary became one more line in the caricature. Surely this was exaggerated. Surely the King of England wasn't flinging out profanity in front of 5-year-olds. Except, he was. The evidence came in waves. Letters from palace staff described verbal storms that erupted during even minor annoyances. Missing spoons, late carriages, crumpled waistcoats. One lady-in-waiting recalled being reduced to silence after the king, frustrated by a drafty window, launched into a tirade that included at least 3 new verbs and 2 references to livestock. Another account, quietly passed down in court memoirs, told of a royal luncheon where a visiting duke brought his young grandchildren. When one of them accidentally spilled soup, William reportedly barked, "Oh, for heaven's sake, you little using a term that, while not printable here, rhymed with tart. And the best part? He didn't seem to realize, or care, that anyone found this inappropriate. Unlike other monarchs who hid behind etiquette or layers of palace protocol, William was startlingly unfiltered. His upbringing in the Navy had left him with little patience for pomp and even less for politeness. He preferred directness, even if it meant dropping some naval-grade commentary during a christening. To his defenders, this was part of his charm. He was honest, relatable, a working-class king on a velvet throne. He disliked aristocratic snobbery and often mocked court rituals. He once referred to court musicians as a bunch of bleeding peacocks and insisted that his coronation be cheaper and shorter than his brother's. In many ways, William represented the last gasp of royal casualness before the Victorian era tightened every button and sanitized every syllable. But that didn't stop the awkward moments. Like the time a foreign diplomat's wife was reportedly so shocked by the king's language at a garden party that she dropped her parasol and fainted into a hedge. The official palace report called it an unfortunate incident due to the heat. Of course it was. And yet, William's unfiltered mouth is almost tame compared to what came next, because his niece, Queen Victoria, didn't just bend the rules of propriety, she broke them with feathers, literally. The next rumor wasn't about insults or tantrums. It was about a parrot, trained to insult members of Parliament. 9. Queen Victoria did try to train her parrot to say rude things about politicians. By the time Queen Victoria took the throne in 1837, Britain had entered a new age of rigidity, moral decorum, and stiff upper-lip propriety. Or so everyone thought. Under the corsets and court protocol, however, beat the heart of a monarch with a sharp sense of humor and a private delight in petty rebellion. Which brings us to the rumor that Queen Victoria, the literal face of 19th century morality, tried to teach her parrot to insult politicians. Not accidentally, not as a fluke, deliberately. At first, this sounded like pure Victorian satire. The woman who gave her name to an entire era of buttoned-up seriousness, whispering insults into a birdcage? Surely not. Cartoons and gossip columns poked fun at it, but nobody truly believed that Her Majesty, widow of Albert and Empress of India, spent her off hours feeding crackers to a foul-mouthed parrot while muttering slander about backbench MPs. Except, that's exactly what she did. Multiple accounts from the royal household, unearthed long after her death, confirmed that Victoria kept several birds over the years. Among them was a particularly talkative parrot that resided in one of her sitting rooms during the later years of her reign. It wasn't just decorative, it was interactive. And Victoria, ever the private entertainer, saw its mimicry as an opportunity. Letters from her ladies-in-waiting mention her repeated attempts to teach the bird certain phrases. These weren't charming greetings or biblical quotations. They were political jabs. Some were direct insults, descriptions of particular ministers as tiresome, dreary, or hopeless creatures. Others were more theatrical, including one attempted phrase, "You dreadful man, go away," aimed at a particular chancellor whose name was carefully left out of the notes. The goal, apparently, was to have the parrot squawk these insults in public, ideally during meetings or as a surprise comment during tea. Whether it ever performed on cue remains unclear, but the mere effort paints a very different picture of Victoria than the dour widow we're so often presented. It makes a strange kind of sense. She was surrounded by formality, constantly observed, and rarely given the luxury of candor. A talking bird, however, could say the things she couldn't. It could mimic her frustrations. It could speak the truth without consequence. And in that way, the parrot became something between a pet and a proxy. Of course, this little rebellion stayed quiet. No official records mention it. Portraits don't include the bird. And public speeches remained, as expected, deeply serious. But in her private chambers, the most powerful woman in the world was apparently coaching a tropical bird to mock her political enemies. It's a tiny, ridiculous detail. And yet, it reveals a much larger truth about monarchy. Even queens need an outlet. Some write in diaries. Some confide in close friends. Victoria apparently preferred a feathered accomplice. But the royal tendency toward unusual bedtime habits didn't stop with talking parrots. Because behind closed doors, Victoria had another ritual, one far stranger and more intimate than gossiping with a bird. Every night, without fail, she went to bed with her husband, or rather, with his portrait. 10. Victoria also slept with a portrait of her dead husband. Every single night, Queen Victoria is remembered for many things: an empire that spanned continents, a reign that shaped an entire age, and a stare so severe it could curdle milk. But behind the crown, the politics, and the endless black mourning dresses, there was a love story. Or more accurately, a long, drawn-out, deeply unsettling afterword to one. The rumor was whispered for decades, and at first it just sounded melodramatic, that after the death of her beloved husband, Prince Albert, Queen Victoria never truly let him go. Not emotionally, not symbolically. And, as the strangest version of the story claimed, not physically either. According to palace gossip, she brought a portrait of Albert to bed every night, tucked it in, spoke to it, slept beside it, like a child with a favorite doll. It was hard to tell whether people found this romantic or unnerving. But for years, most historians assumed the story was embellished, a sentimental exaggeration born from public mourning. Then the letters surfaced. Diaries, first-hand accounts from her ladies-in-waiting, and suddenly the absurd rumor became undeniable. Victoria didn't just mourn Albert, she immersed herself in mourning him. After his death in 1861, she transformed her life into a long, elaborate shrine. His clothes were laid out every morning. His shaving water was prepared, as though he might return from the grave in need of a clean chin. And in her private bedchamber, she maintained a nightly ritual that was equal parts devotion and ritualized denial. Each evening, before retiring, Victoria's servants were instructed to place a framed portrait of Albert on his side of the bed. The image varied, sometimes a sketch, sometimes a daguerreotype, but it was always him, always beside her, always arranged just so. The sheets were pulled back for him, his nightgown was laid out, and the portrait was tucked in, not metaphorically, literally. The Queen referred to this act as keeping company. In her journals, she wrote of sharing the quiet night with her dearest one, and sometimes left short notes for him on the pillow. When traveling, she took the portrait with her, often refusing to sleep unless it was placed exactly where he would have been. This ritual continued not for weeks, not for months, but for decades. To outsiders, it was bizarre. To insiders, it was routine. Generations of palace staff quietly honored the tradition, because no one dared tell the queen that maybe, just maybe, it was time to move the frame off the mattress. But what looks like eccentricity from the outside often masks something deeper. Victoria lost Albert when she was just 42. He had been not only her husband, but her emotional ballast, her advisor, her tether to a world beyond court ritual. His death was a fracture in her reality. So she did what monarchs are so disturbingly good at doing. She replaced presence with performance. She staged intimacy. She transformed grief into theater, night after night, for the rest of her life. It's a haunting image, a queen, alone in bed, whispering goodnight to a man who's been dead for years. But compared to the next royal secret, it's positively quaint. Because the next king didn't whisper to portraits, he drank from his cane. Yes, really. His walking stick wasn't for balance, it was for brandy. 11. Edward VII's walking stick really contained secret liquor. Of all the tools a monarch might carry, scepter, orb, ceremonial sword, none was quite as personal or as deceptively functional as Edward VII's walking stick. It was elegant, polished, and always at his side. But the real story wasn't the wood or the workmanship. It was what was inside. The rumor was already swirling by the time Edward was Prince of Wales that he carried alcohol in his cane, not metaphorically, literally, that his walking stick was secretly a hollow vessel, custom-built to transport a personal stash of liquor. The idea was so absurd it practically invited disbelief. A royal flask disguised as a mobility aid? Surely not. Surely the future king wasn't sneaking sips between engagements like a Victorian street magician. And yet, he absolutely was. Let's back up. Edward VII, before ascending the throne, spent most of his life as the longest-serving heir in British history up to that point. He waited in the wings for decades while his mother, Queen Victoria, reigned over an empire and grieved herself into historical permanence. Edward, meanwhile, filled the long empty space of royal waiting with parties, travel, social clubs, and a great deal of brandy. He was known for his indulgence. The press called him Bertie. Courtiers called him his roundness, both affectionately and otherwise. But the image that stuck was of a man constantly seeking comfort, and not just from food and company. His relationship with alcohol was so consistent, so woven into his public and private routines, that it ceased to be a secret and became part of the myth. Which brings us back to the cane. Decades after his death, his private effects were catalogued and displayed in various exhibitions. Among the cufflinks and cuffed trousers, curators noted an unusual artifact, a hollowed-out walking stick with a detachable silver cap. Inside, a glass vial, fitted perfectly. Too small for medicine, too elegant for water. It didn't take long to confirm this was a royal flask, custom-made for stealthy sips. Historians debated the content. Some say it held brandy, others insist it was cognac. There's even an account suggesting he once had a version filled with port. Whatever the vintage, the point was clear. Edward didn't like to be without his drink, even in public, even while walking. And to be fair, the walking stick wasn't his only trick. Reports from staff mention his wardrobe was modified to allow for concealed flasks in coat linings. His carriages were stocked like mobile bars. On one occasion, he allegedly turned down champagne, not because he didn't want it, but because he'd already packed something smoother. But the cane remains the most iconic, a symbol of royal indulgence disguised as respectability. Perfect posture, perfect polish, perfectly secret. It wasn't just alcohol. It was access. It was control. In a world where every movement was choreographed, Edward found a way to carry his vices with him, no questions asked. And if you thought the cane was wild, you're not ready for the next relic of royal leisure. Because Edward VII didn't just drink discreetly, he sat discreetly too. The next confirmed rumor, that the king had a custom chair designed for one specific scandalous purpose, And no, it wasn't for reading. 12. Edward VII also had a custom chair designed for him to sit in during romantic visits. There are chairs. And then there are royal chairs, stately, carved, and perfectly positioned beneath a portrait of a dead ancestor. And then there was Edward VII's chair, perhaps the most infamous piece of royal furniture never officially documented in a palace inventory. The rumor, whispered in elite salons and muttered behind closed doors of Parisian brothels, was this: Edward VII had a specially designed chair built for his romantic encounters. A chair not for reading, not for sitting with dignified repose, but engineered, structurally and logistically, for affairs. It sounded like the kind of wild tabloid fever dream that 19th century moralists would dream up just to scandalize themselves. And yet, it was real. Let's set the scene. Before he became king, Edward VII spent decades as the Prince of Wales with not much to do but wait. Queen Victoria, deep in mourning, had no interest in giving him serious responsibilities. So he traveled. He dined. He became an international connoisseur of leisure and of romantic liaisons. His visits to France in particular became legendary, especially his patronage of certain high-end Parisian establishments that preferred discretion and catered to royalty with a flair for the unconventional. One such establishment was the famed brothel Le Chabanais. Unlike its seedier counterparts, it was a palace of velvet and mirrors where Europe's elite played out their double lives in private rooms themed like stage sets. It was here, reportedly, that Edward not only became a regular guest, but a furnished one. The story, dismissed for years as lurid fiction, claimed that Edward commissioned a special piece of furniture to make his visits more ergonomically feasible. The chair, often referred to in whispers as la chaise d'amour, was said to support the king's substantial frame during, let's call it, extended engagements. Built of mahogany and brass, it featured armrests, stirrups, side supports, and oddly placed padding, an entire engineering feat built to ensure comfort and efficiency. The French press had a field day. British officials predictably denied everything. But then came the twist. The chair surfaced. Today, the infamous love chair can be seen at the Musée d'Orsay in Paris, restored and displayed with clinical detachment, as if it weren't designed by a monarch with time, money, and very specific needs. The museum tactfully describes it as a piece of custom furniture associated with Edward VII, though the function is, even without signage, very clear. The irony, of course, is that Edward VII, who would later be crowned king with full pageantry, spent his younger years crafting a reputation that the throne could never quite scrub away. While Queen Victoria turned mourning into mythology, her son turned leisure into legend, leaving behind not just dusty portraits, but actual furniture too scandalous for Buckingham Palace. And yet the story doesn't end there. Because while Edward was busy customizing his chair, his wife's sister-in-law, Queen Alexandra, was doing something just as strange in front of her vanity. The next rumor? She painted her skin to make her veins look bluer, because nothing says aristocracy like looking just a little undead. 13. Queen Alexandra used makeup to paint her veins blue to look more aristocratic. In an era when bloodlines were everything, appearances followed close behind. Royals didn't just rule like aristocrats, they had to look the part, and looking the part, as it turns out, could involve some fairly bizarre makeup choices. The rumor that clung to Queen Alexandra, wife of Edward VII, was strangely specific, that she painted her veins blue, not as a medical oddity or a theatrical accident, but as a deliberate beauty ritual meant to make her appear more aristocratic. To understand how truly absurd that sounds, you have to imagine the mindset of the late Victorian elite. Nobility wasn't just a title, it was an aesthetic. Aristocrats were supposed to be pale, delicate, and almost ethereal, untouched by labor or sunlight or, heaven forbid, melanin. The phrase blue blood didn't emerge from nowhere. European elites, obsessed with lineage and complexion, used it as a shorthand for nobility. Blue veins, visible beneath pale skin, became a visual cue for high breeding. So the rumor went. Alexandra, ever mindful of public perception, took this quite literally. With the help of her attendants, she used makeup to enhance the visibility of her veins, especially those on her hands, neck, and temples. Fine blue lines drawn over pale foundation, giving the illusion that her skin was practically translucent, her blood royal to the point of artifice. At the time, people dismissed the story as ridiculous. Surely no royal would go to such extremes. Surely Alexandra, known for her grace and quiet dignity, would not dab on blue paint like a porcelain doll being prepped for auction. Except, she did. Evidence trickled out from the most unlikely of sources: court makeup artists, fashion historians, and preserved beauty kits. Decades after Alexandra's death, researchers examining her personal effects found traces of blue pigment among her cosmetics, an unusual substance for someone who otherwise favored neutral tones. Her vanity table included finely tipped brushes, unusually small for general use, but perfectly suited for detail work. What's more, letters from her ladies-in-waiting refer almost casually to the Queen's vein preparations, with one describing the practice as delicate work requiring a steady hand. Alexandra herself never addressed it in writing, but then again, few women of her station openly discussed their beauty routines, especially when they involved artfully faking one's own anatomy. But the impulse behind it was all too human. Alexandra lived in the long shadow of Victoria, married a man who was publicly unfaithful, and reigned in an age where appearance was power. If she could make her skin whisper royalty before she ever opened her mouth, why wouldn't she? In a world where being born noble wasn't enough, you had to look it. Painting on prestige was simply another tool in the royal arsenal. And while her veins may have been a performance, the obsession with appearances didn't stop with Alexandra. Her daughter-in-law, Queen Mary, took the pageantry a step further. She didn't just look like royalty, she collected it. The next confirmed rumor? Queen Mary had a habit of borrowing valuables from other people's homes and forgetting to give them back. 14. Queen Mary hoarded random objects from everywhere she visited. When Queen Mary came to visit, people locked up their valuables, not out of fear, but out of quiet, knowing dread. The rumor that followed her across the drawing rooms and country estates of Britain was equal parts comical and unsettling, that Queen Mary, consort to George V, had a peculiar habit of helping herself to items that didn't belong to her. A vase here, a trinket there, perhaps a porcelain figurine or an antique snuff box. No theft in the criminal sense, just a gentle royal form of acquisition. At first, the rumor was brushed off as an upper-class joke, a little jab at the Queen's well-known obsession with antiques. She had impeccable taste, after all, and a genuine passion for collecting. The idea that she might accidentally walk off with someone's silverware or Art Deco ashtray seemed like harmless gossip, too ridiculous to be real. And yet, it was very real. The term palace staff eventually adopted, quietly, behind closed doors, was Queen Mary's kleptomania. It wasn't malicious. It wasn't even especially subtle. Guests would find that after one of her visits, a small item had disappeared, and was now proudly on display at one of the royal residences. The process was strangely ritualistic. She would admire an object out loud, effusively, elaborately. She might say, "What a charming little piece this is. So unique. Wherever did you find it?" Then, a moment later, she might lean in and murmur something like, "Such things ought to be seen in the royal collection, don't you think?" There was no formal request, no paperwork, just a smile, a nod, and the royal expectation that the item would be donated, which is to say, quietly surrendered. In many cases, the owners felt they had no choice. After all, how do you say no to the Queen? A few brave souls did try. Some told her that the item in question was an heirloom or promised to a relative. In these rare instances, Queen Mary would allegedly sigh, nod graciously, and move on, only to return to the same house weeks later and ask about it again. There are documented cases of this happening across aristocratic estates, British embassies, and even aboard royal yachts. A former ambassador's wife once described how a rare hand-painted dish vanished after tea with the Queen. When she wrote to the palace about it, she received a gracious thank you note and a subtle hint that the piece had found a suitable home. Over the years, these borrowed objects quietly made their way into royal displays. Curators later cataloged them without much commentary, but the stories behind them lingered. Little things with big histories, relocated not by conquest, but by compliments. It's a strange legacy, a queen who elevated collecting into a subtle power play. Some hoarders fill their basements. Queen Mary filled the monarchy. But not every royal collected antiques. Some preferred companionship. The next monarch on our list didn't talk to guests or servants when he was bored. He talked to his stamp collection, like it was alive. And the weirder part? He wasn't joking. 15. George V talked to his stamp collection as if it were alive. Some kings hold councils, some hold court. George V? He held conversations, with postage. The rumor began innocently enough. George V, before and during his reign, was known to be a passionate philatelist, a stamp collector of the highest and most meticulous order. No one questioned that part. In fact, it was one of the few universally acknowledged facts about him. He had the discipline of a naval officer, the reserve of a Victorian gentleman, and the organizational instincts of a museum curator. What raised eyebrows, however, was the increasingly persistent whisper that the king didn't just admire his stamps. He spoke to them, not in jest, not as a passing joke, but regularly, privately, and with quiet sincerity, as though each small square of ink and paper were a living envoy from another world. At first, it sounded like affectionate exaggeration. Surely the king, known for his stiff mustache and stricter schedule, wasn't cooing over envelopes. Surely this was a case of palace staff inventing a harmless quirk to make a rather stiff monarch seem more relatable. And yet, over time, enough first-hand accounts emerged to suggest that this wasn't a harmless myth. It was a daily routine. In letters and journals written by his private secretaries, there are multiple references to His Majesty's dialogues with the post, stamp room murmurs, and in one particularly candid note, a comment that the king had spent the better part of a rainy afternoon consoling a misprinted Cape of Good Hope triangle. The Royal Philatelic Collection, arguably the most valuable stamp archive in the world, wasn't just a hobby to George V. It was a sanctuary, a world he could control completely. Each stamp was cataloged, documented, and stored with obsessive care. His annotations were done in pencil, his album pages designed with military precision, and when he spoke to them, quietly, deliberately, it wasn't out of madness. It was out of reverence. Servants reported hearing him address rare stamps by their full names. "There you are, my little Mauritius," he allegedly said to a 1-penny blue. He complimented centering, chided smudges, and once remarked that an envelope from Ceylon had the good sense not to wrinkle under pressure. To him, they were more than collectibles. They were characters, survivors, artifacts of diplomacy, war, empire, and everyday life. It was, in a way, the most royal thing he could do, carry on a relationship with pieces of paper that had once traveled the world, bearing the symbols of monarchs, governments, and forgotten countries. While the world outside his palace changed, wars erupting, empires crumbling, George V returned to his albums, where everything was still in order, everything had its place, and everything, most importantly, listened. It may sound silly, but what's sillier, really? A king who talks to stamps, or one who teaches birds to swear at his enemies? Because that's exactly where we're headed next. George V had a second, even pettier hobby, training his parrots to curse out politicians he couldn't stand. And yes, it absolutely happened. 16. George V taught his parrots to swear at politicians he disliked. By now, we've established that King George V had a fondness for quiet hobbies, sitting for hours among his stamps, cataloging the world in miniature, and occasionally speaking to inanimate postal artifacts as if they were guests at dinner. But there was another side to him, less methodical, more mischievous, and far more vocal. That's where the parrots come in. The rumor, naturally, seemed too absurd to believe. That the king, the same monarch who ruled during World War I and rebranded the royal family from Saxe-Coburg-Gotha to Windsor to sound less German, spent part of his time teaching birds to swear at members of parliament. Specific politicians. By name. At first, this tale was dismissed as classic post-Edwardian satire. A grumpy old king barking orders and parrots squawking back in Westminster accents? That had to be a cartoonist's fantasy. Even those within the palace circle regarded it as a strange kind of urban legend, a joke born of George's famously sharp tongue and unshakable opinions. And yet, as is so often the case with royal rumors, the strangest version of the story turned out to be closest to the truth. Accounts from palace staff eventually confirmed it. George V kept parrots, multiple in fact, primarily housed at Sandringham, and sometimes brought to Windsor for amusement. These weren't decorative pets or ambient squawkers. They were part of his daily routine. The king would feed them, speak to them, and, when particularly irked by politics, test out a few choice phrases to see if the birds would echo them. According to the diaries of one former footman, the king's favorite African grey had been successfully trained to refer to a certain cabinet minister as an insufferable little tick, a phrase His Majesty found particularly amusing. Another account described how during one tense political week, a parrot repeated the phrase, "fool of the highest order," every time the name of a well-known peer was mentioned. Coincidence? Perhaps not. George, it turns out, had a method. He would reportedly repeat phrases in a slow, precise tone, often while feeding the birds. He once joked, "It's the only way to make sure someone says what I'm thinking." Visitors to his private study occasionally reported hearing an eruption of rude commentary followed by royal laughter and a dismissive wave. One journalist later recalled being startled by a parrot shouting, "No more taxes, you rascal!" from the corner of the room, only to have George grin and remark, "At least he listens." This behavior never reached the official record, of course. No mention in the court circular, no lines in the Hansard. But within the walls of his private residences, George found a bizarre but oddly effective outlet. When duty required silence, a parrot could say what a king could not. The birds became more than pets. They were vessels of royal sarcasm. It was harmless in the grand scheme, but not without irony. A monarch who embodied imperial dignity during one of Britain's most turbulent eras, secretly using tropical birds to heckle his enemies. And the royal eccentricities just kept escalating from there. Because while George was busy training birds, his son, the future Edward VIII, was insisting on weekly repairs for his childhood teddy bear, a grown man, a future king, scheduling maintenance appointments for a stuffed animal. 17. Edward VIII wanted his teddy bear repaired weekly, like a royal schedule. For a man who would one day shake the foundations of the monarchy, Edward VIII began life with one surprisingly soft constant: a well-loved, well-worn teddy bear. That much, on its own, is ordinary. Many children keep sentimental objects into adulthood. Many even store them in boxes, tucked away from the world like small, private relics of a simpler life. But Edward was different. The rumor that clung to him, treated as comic exaggeration for years, claimed he not only kept his childhood teddy bear well into adulthood, but insisted the royal staff maintain it. Not occasionally. Not when it was damaged. Weekly, like a standing appointment on the royal calendar. Naturally, most people assumed this was satire. Edward was controversial for political reasons, romantic reasons, constitutional reasons, But surely no one genuinely believed he had a dedicated teddy bear caretaker on the royal payroll. Even his critics, who relished painting him as immature, self-indulgent, and unserious, rarely treated the story as anything more than symbolic mockery. Except, of course, the rumor turned out to be precisely true. The confirmation came not from tabloids or gossips, but from the very people who served him. One former valet described the bear in startling detail. Small, misshapen from years of hugging, its fur thinning in places, its threads tired and softened. And yet, the prince treated it with the care of a priceless artifact. He requested, no, required, that it receive routine restoration. Bow ties restitched, arms reinforced, ears refluffed, lost buttons replaced with authentic buttons, as if the bear were a museum piece rather than a childhood companion. A seamstress employed at the palace in Edward's early years confirmed that she was summoned regularly, sometimes weekly, to inspect the bear for wear and tear. She initially assumed this was a temporary task for a young boy. But as the prince grew into adolescence, then adulthood, then heir apparent to the throne, the appointments continued. The teddy was always on the list. There is a strange tenderness to this. Edward VIII, who would become king only briefly before abdicating, lived his entire adult life feeling out of place. Too modern for his family, too romantic for the monarchy, too impatient for the crown's slow ceremonial machinery. So he held on to the one object from his childhood that didn't judge him, didn't disappoint him, didn't require him to perform. The teddy bear became a constant in a life defined by instability, psychological scaffolding disguised in faded fabric. But of course, the palace's patience had limits. The staff reportedly joked that the bear received more consistent health care than the average British citizen of the era. One footman claimed the weekly inspection was referred to, semi-seriously, as the royal wellness check. Edward, oblivious or indifferent to the whispers, continued the ritual. The bear traveled with him. It accompanied him on visits. It had its own designated drawer in every residence. And yet, this wasn't even the most indulgent rumor surrounding Edward VIII, because if the teddy bear represented childlike sentimentality, the next revelation represented something far more adult and far more absurd. For alongside his treasured stuffed companion, Edward insisted on another luxury, a man whose sole job was breaking in his shoes. Yes, a professional shoe softener, a dedicated employee to walk in the king's footwear so he never had to feel stiffness or discomfort for a single step. 18. Edward VIII hired a man whose only job was to break in his shoes. There are eccentricities, and then there's logistical absurdity. Edward VIII, already known for romantic scandal, emotional impulsiveness, and royal nonchalance, added yet another layer to his legend with one of the most comically unnecessary job appointments in royal history. The rumor? That the Prince of Wales, later King Edward VIII, for less than a year famously, employed a man for the singular purpose of breaking in his shoes, not shining them, not maintaining them, just wearing them, quietly and consistently, until they were supple enough for royal feet. At first, this sounded like something out of a satirical sketch. Aristocratic excess at its most ridiculous. The sort of story you'd hear over a half-hearted gin cocktail and assume had been exaggerated for effect. Surely no one was so pampered, so allergic to discomfort, that they required a designated shoe softener, and if such a person existed, surely the monarchy would have kept it a closely guarded secret. But again, the absurd turns out to be real. Historical records, including staff memoirs, archived expense lists, and a particularly revealing interview with one of Edward's former valets, confirmed the existence of the role. Officially, the man was listed among general footmen. Unofficially, everyone knew his real function. He wore the prince's brand new shoes before the prince ever touched them, walked them up and down polished palace halls, occasionally strolled them through gravel paths, if the prince was planning an outdoor event, even stood in them for hours at a time to mimic the strain of a royal engagement. The logic, such as it was, followed Edward's lifelong aversion to discomfort. He believed in tailoring, luxury, soft fabrics, and well-broken leather. New shoes, he insisted, distracted him. A stiff heel ruined his focus. A rigid sole made walking unpleasant. And so, rather than adjust to the shoe adjusted to him, via someone else's feet. The designated walker had to be roughly the same size and weight as the prince, close enough to mold the leather properly but not so large as to warp the fit. He was reportedly provided specific instructions about posture, gait, and even walking style. Too slow? The shoes wouldn't flex right. Too fast? The creases would appear in the wrong places. It was, ironically, a job requiring precision and discretion, performed in silence behind the scenes, with barely a word spoken about it at court. And no, Edward wasn't joking. He took this role seriously. The shoe man remained employed for years. When Edward became king, there was even discussion about bringing the practice into the formal royal household, though by then his reign was already on borrowed time. It's hard not to view this as a metaphor for his entire life. Other people doing the difficult, uncomfortable work so that Edward could glide effortlessly forward. A man unwilling to break in his own shoes, or, as history would show, carry the burden of the crown when it pinched even slightly. And yet, even Edward's luxurious quirks pale in comparison to what came next. Because while he pampered his feet, his future mother-in-law, the Queen Mother herself, was secretly hiding chocolate in palace rooms like a mischief-prone schoolchild. Dozens of secret stashes, none of them official, all of them very real. 19. Elizabeth Bowes Lyon, the Queen Mother, hid chocolates in different palace rooms like a child. Among all the towering figures of the 20th century monarchy, Elizabeth Bowes Lyon, later known simply as the Queen Mother, crafted a reputation of unshakable poise, unflappable charm, and bottomless resilience. She smiled through war. She steadied her famously stammering husband. She outlived nearly everyone, but the rumor that endured in hushed palace corners wasn't about statecraft or strength. It was about chocolate. More specifically, it was whispered that the Queen Mother, well into her adult life and even during her decades-long widowhood, hid chocolates throughout royal residences like a gleeful, sugar-crazed child playing a game no one else had been invited to join. At first glance, this sounded sweet in the metaphorical sense. Maybe it was just a symbol of her warmth, a way of humanizing a royal figure who was otherwise seen as granite with pearls. But the details were oddly specific. The rumor wasn't just that she liked sweets, it was that she hoarded them. Deliberately, strategically. As if her palaces might be unexpectedly overrun by chocolate thieves at any moment, and only she would be prepared. And then, of course, the rumors proved true. Over time, multiple former palace staff came forward with corroborating stories. Maids, footmen, and chefs described how they were regularly surprised to find partially unwrapped chocolate bars tucked behind curtain tassels, inside unused teapots, nestled discreetly inside sideboard drawers. One cleaner allegedly found a tin of chocolate truffles inside a hollowed-out book of poetry. Another discovered a stash of caramels behind a loose panel in a drawing room cabinet at Clarence House. These weren't forgotten sweets. They were placed, intentionally, sometimes in groups, sometimes individually. One butler recalled that the Queen Mother had the mischievous delight of a child when rediscovering them, as if she herself had forgotten where they'd been hidden, or perhaps pretended to forget, just to enjoy the rediscovery all the more. And it wasn't just limited to one residence. The phenomenon was reported at Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, and especially Clarence House, where she spent most of her later years. The stashes weren't always found by staff. Sometimes a guest would sit on a couch cushion and hear the unmistakable crinkle of foil. If they looked confused, she would simply smile and say, "Oh, that's mine," and then carry on as if there weren't chocolate-covered almonds embedded in the upholstery. Why the secrecy? No one knows for certain. Perhaps it was a holdover from wartime rationing, a kind of indulgent rebellion against decades of scarcity. Or perhaps it was simply that Elizabeth liked the game of it, liked having a little secret joy waiting behind a vase or tucked between photo frames. It's the kind of quirk that turns a monarch into a person. The Queen Mother, the matriarch of Britain's most famous family, giggling as she sneaks a square of chocolate from behind a curtain. Not plotting, not politicking, just quietly delighting in sugar and secrecy. And if her hidden chocolates were innocent fun, her next indulgence had a bit more kick. Because as it turns out, she didn't just hide sweets. She spiked her afternoon tea, regularly, with gin. Not in scandal, but in ritual. And yes, there were recipes. 20. The Queen Mother also spiked her afternoon tea with gin. Every day she wore pastel coats and pearls. She curtsied like clockwork. She was Britain's wartime darling, the Queen Consort who never flinched, never left London, never cracked under Blitz-era pressure. But behind the perfectly coordinated brooches and lavender-scented respectability, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, the Queen Mother, had a rather consistent and thoroughly verified ritual. She added gin to her afternoon tea. Not once in a while. Not as a celebratory indulgence. Every single day. The rumor had been floating around since at least the 1950s. Courtiers whispered it in private. Visiting politicians joked about the tea that talks back. Even within the palace kitchens, there were nods and winks about preparing Her Majesty's usual. But because the Queen Mother had cultivated such an image of gentle stoicism and grandmotherly charm, most assumed it was just a bit of affectionate exaggeration, something to make her seem more human, more cheeky. But as more records came to light, including household logs, staff memoirs, and first-hand accounts from chefs and footmen, it became abundantly clear the gin and tea rumor wasn't just true, it was a daily institution. Every afternoon, at precisely the same hour, whether she was at Clarence House, Balmoral, or on royal tour, tea would be served. But unlike the rest of the Windsor clan, who leaned toward the standard brews and cucumber sandwiches, the Queen Mother preferred her tea fortified. Gin was the liquor of choice. Sometimes Gordon's. Occasionally something more botanical, if the chef had been feeling fancy. The serving staff had very clear instructions. The gin was to be poured in first, then a splash of Dubonnet, a fortified wine she also adored, followed by hot tea and, if she felt festive, a twist of lemon. It wasn't a splash of gin. It was a unit. Enough to count. This wasn't a secret within palace walls. Staff had affectionate nicknames for the drink, referring to it as the Queen Mum's Breakfast Club, even though it was served in the late afternoon. Some joked that if the gin wasn't poured by 4 p.m., the atmosphere would shift noticeably. Others remembered that when hosting guests, she would encourage them to try a proper cup of tea, raising her own with a knowing smile. And, just to eliminate any doubt, her menus actually included it. Former royal chef Darren McGrady revealed that her daily routine included a pre-lunch drink, wine with lunch, a post-lunch fortified wine, and her afternoon tea cocktail. By the time supper rolled around, one could argue the gin was less a beverage and more a royal companion. But she never appeared flustered, never slurred, and never skipped a public engagement. The gin was somehow part of the performance, a quiet luxury, a royal coping mechanism dressed in china. And if that seems excessive, well, brace yourself. Because the next royal habit didn't involve cocktails, but combustion. Her niece, Princess Margaret, didn't just enjoy a cigarette. She smoked with such zeal that she once set her wig on fire. Indoors, in front of people. And yes, someone had to put it out. 21. Princess Margaret smoked so hard she once set her wig on fire. If Queen Elizabeth II was duty, discipline, and tightly managed public image, her younger sister, Princess Margaret, was the monarchy's wild card. She was glamour with a sharp tongue, elegance with a hangover, royalty with the volume turned all the way up. Known for her love of parties, sharp wit, and theatrical flair, Margaret was always just slightly out of step with royal convention, and entirely on purpose. Which brings us to one of the most bizarre, long-whispered rumors of her later years. That she smoked so aggressively, so incessantly, that she set her wig on fire. In public. By accident. Mid-conversation. For years, this story sounded like exaggerated gossip. The kind of thing a disgruntled valet might leak to the tabloids for a payday. It had the air of urban legend. Too dramatic, too absurd, too perfectly Margaret. But, as with so many tales orbiting the royal family, the punchline turned out to be uncomfortably real. Multiple palace insiders and domestic staff later confirmed the incident. It didn't happen at some wild club or exotic villa. It happened during a fairly routine social gathering, indoors, surrounded by polite company, in one of the royal residences. Margaret, resplendent as always in a carefully selected outfit, was seated, chatting, cocktail in one hand, cigarette in the other. She leaned back. The cigarette remained dangerously close to her carefully styled wig. And then, flicker, fizzle, flame. According to one staff member who witnessed it, there was a brief moment of stunned silence, as if no one was quite sure whether this was a dramatic metaphor brought to life or a genuine fire hazard. But the truth was painfully obvious. The edge of her wig was smoldering. Whether from synthetic material or lacquered hairspray, it caught fast. Fortunately, the flame was quickly patted out. No lasting damage to Margaret, though the same could not be said for the wig. Her reaction? Allegedly, she was more annoyed than alarmed. She dismissed it with a muttered joke, took another sip of her drink, and lit a fresh cigarette within the hour. This was Margaret in essence, unshaken, unapologetic, and dramatically unbothered by royal optics. Her lifelong affair with tobacco was never secret. She started smoking as a teenager, continued through adulthood, and famously paired her cigarettes with vodka, Chanel No. 5, and withering sarcasm. Her style was old Hollywood meets aristocratic defiance. She didn't care who judged her, and if someone tried, she'd likely outdress and outdrink them before the evening ended. The wig fire became one of those unofficial palace stories that insiders never forgot, equal parts ridiculous and revealing. It captured Margaret's contradictions perfectly, the glamour, the recklessness, the performative control that sometimes burned a little too hot. And yet, as chaotic as that moment was, it's barely a blip compared to what came next. Because Margaret didn't just light up a room, she traveled with one. Specifically, a bathroom. That's right. The next confirmed royal rumor involves Princess Margaret transporting her own bath, filled with bottled Saint-Tropez water, to hotels across Europe, because ordinary plumbing, apparently, simply wouldn't do. 22. Princess Margaret traveled with her own bath, full of Saint-Tropez water. In the long history of royal eccentricities, there are those that feel oddly human, like secret chocolate stashes or stubborn teddy bears. Then there are the truly majestic extremes, the kind of luxury so impractical, so logistically absurd, that they blur the line between aristocratic habit and performance art. Princess Margaret, unsurprisingly, was fluent in both. One of the most persistent rumors to trail her, one that sounded, for years, too ludicrous to be true, was that she not only traveled with her own bath, but had it filled with imported Saint-Tropez water. Not just once. Not for a special event. As a routine. For decades, this rumor floated around the social circles of the Riviera and echoed through London's upper crust. Most wrote it off as a cocktail party exaggeration. The idea that a royal would insist on packing a literal bathtub for travel, along with hundreds of liters of boutique mineral water, seemed excessive even by Margaret's famously lofty standards. She was known for extravagant preferences, but surely even she wouldn't take an entire bathroom with her. And yet, she absolutely did. The truth was finally confirmed by her longtime lady-in-waiting, Anne Glenconner, whose memoirs, written with the dry clarity of someone who had seen it all, gave the rumor legs. According to Glenconner, Margaret's bath ritual was so sacred, so particular, that she couldn't tolerate unknown water, especially when traveling to warmer climates. She believed quite firmly that Saint-Tropez water, where she spent many luxurious summers, was better for her skin. Smoother, softer, less chemical, as she allegedly put it. So the solution was simple. When Margaret traveled, she had a portable bathtub sent ahead. It was packed in its own crate, with fittings designed to resemble the one she used at home. In addition to the tub, bottles of Saint-Tropez water were delivered or arranged through contacts, stored in large glass demijohns, shipped discreetly, and used exclusively to fill the bath. No tap water, no improvising. Her staff understood the ritual perfectly. The temperature had to be exact. The scentless bath oil added at just the right moment. The room pre-warmed, the lighting soft. Margaret would then enter, wine glass in hand, and soak. Not quickly, not privately, but ceremoniously. It wasn't hygiene. It was theater. A performance of control, of indulgence, of untouchable royal rhythm. And yet, there was something sad in it too. Margaret, for all her extravagance, spent her life in her sister's shadow, trapped between royal duty and public scrutiny, craving spaces that felt like hers alone. The bath was one of them, a private domain in a life lived almost entirely in public. Still, the image remains unforgettable. A princess with her own bathtub, guarded like a crown jewel, wheeled through the world one hotel suite at a time. And if you thought that was the peak of royal travel quirks, think again. Because while Margaret bathed in French luxury, her brother-in-law, Prince Philip, insisted on a very different kind of companion while traveling. A radio that only played cricket commentary, non-stop, for hours. Every country, every palace, no exceptions. 23. Prince Philip traveled with a radio that only played cricket commentary. For a man who spent much of his life navigating ceremonial duties and silently walking 3 steps behind the Queen, Prince Philip had a surprisingly loud presence, especially when it came to his private habits. Known for his blunt remarks, stubborn routines, and a lifelong allergy to fuss, the Duke of Edinburgh cultivated a personal world governed by 3 things: order, efficiency, and very specific noise. Which brings us to the long-whispered, gently mocked rumor that Prince Philip always traveled with a personal radio. Not just any radio, a radio set to play only cricket commentary, non-stop, wherever he went. As reliable as his cufflinks, as present as his shoes. At first, this sounded like the sort of quaint exaggeration you might hear from a retired butler or a former footman at a dinner party. A charming tale of a gruff, sports-obsessed duke who couldn't bear silence and found comfort in the crackle of a cricket pitch echoing through static. People assumed the rumor had been polished into fiction, but it hadn't. As multiple former palace aides and insiders have since confirmed, some in interviews, others in memoirs, the cricket commentary wasn't just a preference, it was a requirement. Wherever Prince Philip traveled, whether for official duties, royal tours, or private weekends away, his radio came too. Tucked neatly among his personal items, it was always unpacked and positioned in his temporary quarters with the precision of a military operation. It didn't matter whether he was in the Scottish Highlands or a diplomatic residence in the Caribbean. The radio was to be functional immediately, and it was to be set to Test Match Special, or whatever local equivalent existed for uninterrupted cricket commentary. This wasn't background noise. This was Philip's soundtrack. Staff recalled that he would sometimes walk into a room, turn it on, and nod approvingly at the sound of a commentator describing a particularly tedious over. Even in places where cricket wasn't broadcast locally, his aides were expected to find a way, via shortwave, via satellite, via whatever absurd workaround could be rigged to make it happen. He reportedly claimed that cricket, more than any other sport, created the right kind of silence. It wasn't that he needed constant stimulation, he needed that specific frequency of calm. The steady rhythm of commentary, the polite tension of a match slowly unfolding, the quiet clack of bat on ball. It was, to him, as comforting as birdsong. In one now confirmed story, during a royal tour stop in Southeast Asia, palace staff panicked after realizing local radio didn't carry cricket. Within hours, a portable shortwave unit had been flown in. One aide described it as a diplomatic crisis narrowly avoided by an emergency cricket fix. The Queen reportedly tolerated it with mild amusement. It was, after all, one of his few non-negotiables. And while it may seem like an odd quirk, it fit Philip perfectly. An unsentimental man soothed by structure, detail, and the slow elegance of a sport that rewarded patience. But sometimes, even Prince Philip lost patience, especially with photographers. The next verified rumor? He once looked one dead in the eye and told him he resembled a ghastly vampire. No metaphor, no follow-up explanation, just a royal burn delivered with perfect timing. 24. Philip once told a photographer he looked like a ghastly vampire. Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, had many public roles: consort, naval officer, patron, reluctant ribbon cutter. But perhaps his most consistent personal brand was this: a man constitutionally incapable of keeping a thought to himself. If it crossed his mind, it exited his mouth, often with zero delay and even less filter. Over the years, his off-the-cuff remarks became legendary. Some genuinely funny, others painfully awkward. But the rumor that stuck, stubbornly, was one of the simplest and sharpest: that he once told a royal photographer he looked like a ghastly vampire. For years, this anecdote floated in the orbit of royal folklore. It was short, oddly specific, and just believable enough to pass as a possible Philipism. Still, many people dismissed it as exaggerated tabloid banter, something a bored reporter cooked up to inject drama into a royal photo session. But then came the confirmation. Not from gossip columns, not from secondhand whispers, from the photographer himself. Arthur Edwards, the longtime royal snapper for The Sun, later recounted the incident during a media interview. It happened during a formal engagement, when he and a few other press photographers were waiting to shoot the royal couple. Prince Philip, surveying the scene, zeroed in on one particular man in the group: pale, serious, dark-suited, with the angular look of someone who hadn't seen direct sunlight in a while. Without hesitation, Philip pointed at him and said, "My God, you look like a ghastly vampire." And then he moved on. No apology, no wink, no softening of the blow. It wasn't intended to be cruel. It was just observation as entertainment, delivered with classic Philip bluntness. The photographer, to his credit, reportedly laughed and carried on. After all, when you work with Prince Philip, you learn quickly that compliments are rare and filters are non-existent. This wasn't an isolated moment. Philip had a long and well-documented history of what palace staff called unscheduled remarks. Over the years, he referred to one man's beard as a bloody bird's nest, told a student he'd never amount to much if you stand like that, and once asked a fashion designer if they had forgotten how zippers work. Sometimes he was trying to be funny. Sometimes he wasn't. Either way, the results were the same: bafflement, headlines, and palace press officers quietly wincing in the background. And yet, there was something disarming about it too. In a world of rigid protocol and rehearsed politeness, Philip was, at the very least, honest. His role in the royal machine was often thankless: endless appearances, handshakes, ceremonies, and his coping mechanism was humor with a serrated edge. So yes, he called a man a ghastly vampire, not because he wanted to insult him, but because he couldn't not say it. The line was too good, the timing too perfect. It was a rare royal moment of unfiltered humanity, awkward, hilarious, and absolutely unrepeatable. But if Philip had his codes, so did his wife. The next royal rumor takes us into subtler, more strategic territory, because Queen Elizabeth II didn't need to speak her mind. She used her handbag to do it. Literally. One glance at the floor, one shift of her purse. and the message was clear: rescue me. 25. Queen Elizabeth II used her handbag as a secret communication device. For 7 decades, Queen Elizabeth II reigned as a figure of extraordinary restraint. She said little. She emoted even less. And yet, every seasoned observer knew her silence wasn't empty, it was strategic. In a family infamous for outbursts, scandals, and combusting wigs, the Queen never lost her cool. But when she did want to send a message, she didn't raise her voice. She moved her handbag. The rumor, whispered by palace insiders and protocol junkies alike, was that the Queen's handbag wasn't just an accessory. It was a signal device. A quiet, graceful, ruthlessly efficient tool for communicating what she couldn't say out loud. The notion seemed like something out of a spy novel, far too clever, far too subtle to be real. Except it was real. Verified. Systematic. Practiced like clockwork. For years, people assumed the Queen simply liked having her handbag with her. It matched the outfit. It held a tissue, maybe a mint or two. But journalists and royal watchers began noticing patterns. When she placed her bag on the table during a dinner, shortly after the soup course, staff would suddenly swoop in and the conversation would shift. When she looped it over both arms, not one, her aides appeared within seconds. When she set it on the floor, a full-blown extraction was underway within minutes. Eventually, former royal aides confirmed the truth. Her handbag was her silent alarm system. Here were the codes. Bag on the table, ease, wrap it up. A gentle signal that the Queen was done. Done with the chat, done with the course, possibly just done with the person. Staff were expected to begin moving the schedule along, discreetly of course. Bag on the floor, you wolves, get me out of here. This was the emergency signal, a discreet SOS. If a conversation was dragging, if a guest was talking too much, or if the Queen simply wanted to disappear without drama, the bag hit the floor. Seconds later, a staff member would approach with a fabricated excuse. Your Majesty, the Archbishop is waiting. Or, Ma'am, your private secretary has just arrived. Switching her bag from one arm to the other, I'd like to move on. A subtle nudge, often used during meet and greets. Staff would then subtly shuffle the line forward, ensuring no one lingered longer than their allotted royal minute. It was brilliant. And it allowed Elizabeth to maintain the appearance of unflappable grace, even while managing endless obligations, boring conversations, and the occasional over-enthusiastic diplomat. She didn't need a tantrum. She didn't need to insult anyone. She had a handbag, and decades of training on how to weaponize it with complete plausible deniability. Ironically, the same object that most assumed symbolized traditional femininity turned out to be one of the most powerful tools in her arsenal. In a monarchy built on performance, the Queen had mastered silent choreography. And yet, even she had her softer quirks, ones that weren't strategic, but sentimental. Because while she used her handbag to manage humans, her deepest affection was reserved for something quieter, her cows. Yes, the next rumor is that Queen Elizabeth not only named each of her cattle, but greeted them personally, by name. And no, this is not a metaphor. 26. Queen Elizabeth II also named her cows and greeted them by name. By all public appearances, Queen Elizabeth II was the human embodiment of protocol. Gloved handshakes, perfectly timed nods, and a smile so subtle it could be measured in millimeters. To the world, she was the definition of regal restraint, stoic, steady, and not given to emotional flourishes. But behind the gates of Windsor, away from the cameras and ceremonial pens, Her Majesty had an unexpectedly tender obsession, and it mooed. The rumor? That the Queen didn't just own cattle, she knew them, named them, greeted them by name. Not metaphorically, not out of symbolic affection for the countryside, but literally. Elizabeth, it was said, would walk among her pedigree cows and speak to them like old friends. She remembered their mothers. She tracked their bloodlines. She complimented them on their coats. For decades, this detail was passed around like an eccentric footnote. The monarch loved animals. Everyone knew that. Horses, dogs, corgis. But cows? And not in a grand landowning sense, but in the way a person might bond with houseplants? Yes. And it was all completely true. The Queen maintained a personal herd of rare breed cattle at Windsor. These weren't just symbolic animals trotted out for state visits. They were award-winning, meticulously bred, and personally overseen by Elizabeth herself. She was especially fond of the red Pole and Jersey breeds, heritage cattle known for both beauty and temperament. And unlike the horses, which she rode or raced, the cows were companions of a gentler, more pastoral sort. Staff at Windsor Castle confirmed that the Queen took a deep and active interest in their well-being. She didn't just review reports, she visited them regularly. She strolled the fields, inspected new calves, and addressed individual cows by name, sometimes cooing or muttering little greetings in her clipped, quietly amused tone. Even more surprising, she kept a genealogy book for the herd. A royal family tree, but for livestock. Bloodlines were meticulously recorded. Pairings were planned. Achievements at agricultural shows were noted and celebrated. When one of her cows won a ribbon, she reportedly lit up with more joy than at most parliamentary openings. Former royal aides described the Queen as having an immediate sense of calm when among the cattle. The stiff posture would soften. Her famously careful expression would ease. And if a guest was particularly fortunate or unlucky depending on their interest in agriculture, she might lead them out to meet the cows herself, offering proud introductions like, "This is Mabel. She's descended from my very first prize winner." It wasn't a performance. It was connection. Elizabeth, for all her grandeur, never forgot that she was first and foremost a countrywoman. The palace might have been her workplace, but the pasture was her peace. And so the rumor became history. The Queen really did know her. Cows, by name, by temperament, by heritage. And they, in return, gave her something very few humans could: silent loyalty without politics. But the royal affection for the nonverbal didn't stop at livestock. The next rumor wasn't about cows, but camellias. Prince Charles, long before he became king, was mocked for talking to plants. Critics laughed. Tabloids smirked. But decades later, science offered a surprising twist. He might have been right all along. 27. Prince Charles talked to plants and claimed they responded. It started, like so many royal oddities, as a single quote. A soft-spoken prince, standing in the manicured gardens of one of his many estates, casually mentioned that he talked to his plants. More than that, he claimed they listened, that they responded. That communication, in his view, was a two-way street. The press went wild. It was the 1980s, and Prince Charles, then still decades away from becoming king, was already carving out a reputation as the monarchy's most earnest environmentalist. He was passionate about architecture, soil quality, alternative medicine, and the future of organic farming. But nothing he ever said or believed was quite as mocked as his supposed conversations with plants. The quote that triggered the media feeding frenzy came from a BBC interview in 1986, in which he remarked, "I just come and talk to the plants, really. Very important to talk to them. They respond." He said it earnestly. No wink. No trace of irony. To the tabloids, it was a goldmine. Headlines declared that the heir to the throne had gone full Dr. Dolittle, speaking in hushed tones to geraniums and waiting for spiritual feedback from his petunias. It became one of the most enduring punchlines in royal history. But here's the twist. It wasn't a joke. He meant it. He still does. Charles's belief in talking to plants wasn't a whimsical one-off. It was rooted in his broader, deeply held philosophy that nature isn't just something to be used or controlled, but communed with. He believed in mutual respect between humans and the natural world, long before that became a mainstream idea. His conversations with plants were part meditation, part care, part observation. and in his view, it worked. At Highgrove, his Gloucestershire estate, the gardens he helped design are famously lush, balanced, and meticulously maintained using organic methods. Staff and gardeners who worked with Charles over the years confirmed that he often paused during visits to speak softly to the plants. He wasn't babbling. He was observing, offering encouragement, asking how they were doing, and sometimes jokingly scolding them for misbehaving. And then science did something awkward. In the decades following the media mockery, researchers began investigating the relationship between sound and plant growth. Studies from respected institutions, like the Royal Horticultural Society, eventually confirmed that plants do respond to sound. Vibrations can influence growth patterns. Certain frequencies can accelerate germination. In one study, plants exposed to human speech, particularly female voices, interestingly, showed more robust growth than those left in silence, which means Prince Charles, the man once ridiculed for whispering to his roses, was, scientifically speaking, not wrong. What had been mocked as a royal delusion now looked like quiet foresight. The future king had been speaking not just to plants, but to a truth the rest of the world was only beginning to understand. But if Charles's relationship with nature was soft and introspective, the next royal mystery is anything but. Because his sister, Princess Anne, once made headlines not for talking to anyone, but for yelling at a kidnapper. And what she yelled, in the face of real danger, was so famously British that it belongs in a museum. 28. Princess Anne really chased a kidnapper, yelling at him for being a silly man. Some royal rumors feel too cartoonishly British to be true. Absurd little snippets of dialogue that seem like they were written for a satirical sketch show rather than pulled from a police report. And yet, one of the strangest and most jaw-dropping royal tales of the 20th century really happened. The rumor? That Princess Anne, when faced with an armed kidnapping attempt, stared down her attacker, refused to get out of the car, and shouted, "Not bloody likely!" followed by the unforgettable phrase, "You're a silly man." It was 1974, and Princess Anne, then just 23 years old and newly married, was being driven back to Buckingham Palace after a charity event. She was in the back seat of a royal limousine with her husband, Captain Mark Phillips, when the car was suddenly forced to a stop on the Mall by another vehicle swerving in front of it. A man, later identified as Ian Ball, jumped out of the car wielding a pistol. His plan, it turned out, was to kidnap the Queen's daughter and demand a ransom of £2 million, which he intended to distribute to the poor. It wasn't a well-thought-out plan. Ball shot the chauffeur, he shot a police officer, he injured a passing journalist who tried to intervene. All of this escalated within seconds. But inside the car, Princess Anne refused to play the victim. When Ball opened the door and demanded that she come with him, Anne didn't scream, she didn't cry, she didn't faint. She argued. According to multiple eyewitness accounts, including police reports and later interviews, she responded with immediate, blunt defiance. "Not bloody likely," she snapped, before slamming the car door back in his face. When Ball tried again, she fought him off physically, reportedly resisting his attempt to drag her out of the vehicle. During this surreal standoff, she allegedly muttered the now legendary insult, "You're a silly man." Not "you're insane," not help, but silly. As if she were chastising someone for forgetting to pay a parking meter. The incident only ended when a passing former boxer, Ron Russell, intervened and punched the attacker in the back of the head. Police managed to subdue Ball shortly after. The entire ordeal lasted minutes, but it went down in royal history as one of the most bizarre and badass moments of Princess Anne's life. She received widespread praise for her composure. The Queen awarded medals to those who intervened. Anne herself, when later asked about the event, spoke about it with the same dry, clipped delivery that has made her a cult favorite in recent years. "I was not going to go anywhere with a strange man," she said, as if being kidnapped at gunpoint was merely an inconvenience during a busy week. The rumor, it turned out, didn't even capture the full weirdness of the event. If anything, calling the would-be kidnapper silly was the most restrained part of the entire story. and yet somehow the royal family continued to produce moments that walked the tightrope between absurd and factual. The next rumor involves yet another adult royal with a childhood fixation. This time, it's Prince Andrew, and the whisper that he not only kept a huge collection of teddy bears, but arranged them by category. 29. Prince Andrew traveled with a massive teddy bear collection. There's something deeply British about royalty clinging to childhood comforts. But few things in the royal rumor vault have inspired quite as much head-scratching disbelief as the story of Prince Andrew and his stuffed animals. The rumor was bizarre even by Windsor standards, that the Duke of York, adult man, military officer, son of the Queen, traveled with a huge collection of teddy bears, and not as a nostalgic keepsake tucked discreetly into a drawer. We're talking multiple bears, arranged, coddled, displayed. At first, the story circulated as an offhand anecdote among former palace staff. It sounded like a joke, a lazy metaphor for arrested development, a bit of whispered shade from disgruntled employees. But the details were too consistent, and eventually too well corroborated to ignore. Over time, multiple former royal aides and protection officers confirmed the truth. Andrew did not merely own a childhood teddy bear. He traveled with an entire collection, and was unreasonably particular about how it was handled. The bears weren't tossed on the bed or stashed in a suitcase. They were, according to one former maid, treated like a royal entourage. The bears had specific positions, designated spots in the room, and perhaps most unsettlingly, a kind of unspoken hierarchy. Large bears in the back, small ones in the front, certain plush toys always closest to the pillow, as though standing guard. The story reached full public absurdity when a former royal protection officer, Paul Page, gave an interview years later describing the extent of Andrew's stuffed animal fixation. According to him, visiting Andrew's private quarters was like entering a luxury nursery frozen in time. Dozens of plush toys, primarily teddy bears, sat in perfect formation on his bed. Page explained that staff had to memorize the arrangement. Any deviation could cause the Duke to grow irritable. Another former maid confirmed that the bears were not only counted and organized, but occasionally fluffed, brushed, and gently straightened if they slumped during the day. The expectation was clear. The bears must be kept exactly as the Duke preferred. This was not a request. This was a standing royal instruction. So how did this come to be? Psychologists could, and likely have, written papers on it. Prince Andrew was the Queen's second son, famously referred to as her favorite in some circles. He grew up under the protection of palace walls, the comforting weight of inherited privilege, and very few demands for emotional independence. Whether the bear obsession began as innocent nostalgia or something more psychological, it eventually crossed into routine, ritual even. And the weirdest part? No one stopped him. This wasn't a private habit hidden in the back of a closet. It was part of his known domestic arrangement. Staff were trained, bears were prepared, travel plans included them. But the full scope of the strange only becomes clear in the next rumor. Because Andrew didn't just keep his bears, he required staff to arrange them in a specific formation. There was a laminated photo, a literal guide. It was teddy bear choreography, and yes, every position mattered. 30. Prince Andrew required staff to arrange the bears in a precise formation. Having dozens of teddy bears as an adult royal is one thing. Having a preferred formation for how they should be arranged on your bed and expecting palace staff to follow it with military precision is something else entirely. The rumor that Prince Andrew, Duke of York, maintained a laminated diagram showing exactly how his teddy bears and plush toys should be positioned was once considered too ludicrous to be true. And yet, it wasn't just true, it was standard procedure at Buckingham Palace. For years, whispers about Andrew's plush command circulated quietly among former royal staffers, often laughed off as harmless exaggeration. After all, plenty of people hold on to a sentimental childhood item. But the level of detail described, a photo chart, an expectation of daily reassembly? Surely no adult royal, especially one trained by the Royal Navy, was micromanaging stuffed animal placements. Except he was. The story broke more publicly when Paul Page, a former Royal Protection Officer, revealed in an interview that Andrew's bedroom featured a collection of approximately 50 stuffed toys. They weren't thrown randomly on a shelf. They weren't just for decoration. They were part of a system. According to Page and corroborating former staff members, new palace maids were trained using a photograph kept in the Duke's room. The photo displayed the correct position for each toy, specific placements by size, type, and category. Some were arranged by mood, others by perceived personality. Larger teddy bears were meant to sit at the back, acting almost like plush bodyguards. Medium-sized ones were clustered in the middle. The smallest toys were placed in the front row, almost like they were being presented for inspection. One maid recalled being told, quite firmly, that deviating from the arrangement, even slightly, would result in a complaint. If a bear's head was tilted wrong or its arm was resting unnaturally, it would be noticed. It had to be just so. Each morning after bedmaking, the plush toys had to be returned to their exact places, and each evening before turndown they were carefully fluffed, adjusted, and repositioned. The level of care was not unlike that given to royal medals or ceremonial uniforms. This wasn't a passing phase. The system endured for years, possibly decades. One former member of the household described it as a peculiar daily performance, in which grown professionals carefully choreographed the toys of a grown man as part of the day's routine. Why this obsession with precision? Some speculated that the bear arrangement gave Andrew a sense of stability, an illusion of order in a world of ever-changing obligations and expectations. Others suggested it was simply a royal indulgence allowed to flourish unchecked. In either case, the result was the same. A prince who treated plush toys like palace guards, and, while this royal behavior may seem childish or even comical, it wasn't entirely unique. Because decades earlier, another young royal, Princess Diana, was quietly roller skating through the halls of Buckingham Palace to the soundtrack of Duran Duran. The rumor sounded like 1980s fan fiction. It wasn't. It was real. And the Queen was home. 31. Diana really roller skated around Buckingham Palace while listening to Duran Duran. If the stiff corridors of Buckingham Palace could talk, they might prefer not to. After all, they've seen a lot. Centuries of monarchs, scandals, crown polishings, polite betrayals, and political maneuverings. But sometime in the early 1980s, those same marble floors witnessed something that not even the most seasoned footman could have predicted. The Princess of Wales gliding through the palace halls. On roller skates, headphones in, Duran Duran blasting. The rumor always felt too perfect, too cinematic. The kind of whimsical image you'd expect from a Netflix dramatization, not a palace built on ceremony and centuries of tradition. Princess Diana, young and restless, skating past oil paintings of long-dead kings while hungry like the wolf, echoed from her Walkman. Surely it was myth, a tabloid fantasy. Royal folklore crafted to paint Diana as rebellious, relatable, and adorably ungovernable. But the rumor turned out to be true. Entirely, fabulously true. It was later confirmed in Diana, Her True Story, the now famous biography by Andrew Morton, and supported by former staff members and Diana's own recollections. During the early years of her marriage to Prince Charles, Diana often found herself trapped, physically and emotionally, inside the vast, echoing chambers of Buckingham Palace. Isolated, scrutinized, and increasingly stifled by royal formality, she began carving out pockets of joy wherever she could. One such pocket involved a pair of roller skates and an appetite for pop music. According to palace aides, Diana would strap on her skates, usually in the evenings when things were quieter, and glide through the halls of the private apartments. She'd pop her headphones on, crank up her favorite band, she was famously obsessed with Duran Duran, and take laps through the very heart of royal tradition. Past priceless vases, past historic portraits, past horrified staff pretending not to notice. It wasn't rebellion in the political sense. She wasn't trying to overthrow the monarchy by skating past it. It was escapism, an antidote to the crushing weight of public life and private unhappiness. The juxtaposition was absurd. A teenage-like girl in neon leg warmers and Sony headphones zooming through the home of empire. And that was exactly the point. The story might have remained palace legend if it weren't for the many people who later confirmed it. One palace maid described the sound of soft wheels on polished floors, followed by the unmistakable hum of 1980s synth pop. A security guard recalled being told to look the other way. She wasn't hurting anyone, he said, and honestly, it was the most joy we'd seen in that hallway in years. And in perhaps the most absurd twist of all, this wasn't even done in secret. The Queen was reportedly home during several of these private skating sessions. No official reaction was recorded. But knowing Elizabeth's love of discipline, one imagines she may have simply raised an eyebrow and moved on. And yet the Princess of Wales wasn't done using the palace as her personal playground, because the next confirmed rumor is somehow even more surreal. Diana didn't just skate the halls, she once hid in a cupboard just to jump scare Prince Charles. Yes, an actual royal ambush, no tiara required. 32. Diana once hid in a palace cupboard to jump scare Prince Charles. It sounds like something out of a sitcom written by someone with a dangerously romantic idea of royalty. The future Queen of England crouched inside a cupboard, waiting in silence to leap out at her husband. Not with news of an engagement or a diplomatic update, but with a jump scare. That was the rumor. That Diana, Princess of Wales, once hid in a closet inside Buckingham Palace specifically to surprise Prince Charles. Not for a grand gesture. Not to make a point. Just for fun. Because she thought it would be funny. And in true Diana fashion, it was true. The anecdote first emerged in whispers from former palace staff, mentioned in interviews with a kind of amused reverence. It was the kind of story people assumed was invented to add color to her myth. But over time, as more insiders spoke out, most notably in Andrew Morton's biography and later documentaries, it became clear that this moment wasn't fantasy. It was a very real, very Diana-esque event. Here's what happened. During the early years of their marriage, Diana was still adjusting to the rigid, often suffocating routines of royal life. The formality, the hierarchy, the constant scrutiny. But instead of surrendering to it entirely, she poked holes in the institution wherever she could, with humor, mischief, and flashes of chaotic energy that no amount of protocol could contain. One evening, with the palace unusually quiet, Diana decided to amuse herself. She learned Charles was on his way back from a meeting, and rather than greet him with a curtsy or a polite nod, she crept into a nearby cupboard, a linen closet by most accounts. Not a glamorous room, not a place for princesses. And she waited. How long she was in there is unclear. Some say a few minutes. Others suggest she lingered for quite a while, suppressing giggles and planning her moment. Then, when Charles passed by, the door flew open, and out she popped, laughing. The reaction? Reportedly mixed. Charles, never known for his sense of humor, was startled, but not amused. He didn't find the prank endearing. He found it unserious. This was not the royal image he believed in. Diana, on the other hand, reportedly found the whole thing hilarious and shared the story with friends as proof that she was still herself, despite everything around her being draped in tradition. The story may seem small, but it encapsulates the larger contrast that would come to define Diana's life. The tension between youthful spontaneity and centuries-old institution. Where the palace demanded poise, she offered playfulness. Where the firm expected formality, she brought levity. It wasn't rebellion in the traditional sense. It was more dangerous than that. It was personality, flawed, playful, human, inside a system designed to suppress it. And yet, even Diana's antics weren't the strangest to emerge from the modern royals. Because the final rumor in our collection belongs to a newcomer to the royal stage. Meghan Markle, former actress, new Duchess, was rumored to have stood in front of a mirror, endlessly practicing the Queen's signature wave like it was a choreographed dance. And just like the 32 before it, that one turned out to be true too. 33. Meghan Markle insisted on trying to learn Queen Elizabeth's handshake wave in a mirror. By the time Meghan Markle joined the royal family, the British monarchy had survived revolutions, abdications, world wars, and several decades of poorly received Christmas speeches. But nothing quite prepared them for a Californian actress suddenly trying to learn centuries of etiquette in the span of a few months, armed with Google searches, intuition, and, allegedly, a full-length mirror. The rumor? That Meghan, after getting engaged to Prince Harry and thrust into the global spotlight, stood in front of her mirror at home and obsessively practiced Queen Elizabeth II's famously subtle handshake wave combo. Not just once, not as a lark, but repeatedly, methodically, like she was rehearsing a role. At first glance, it sounded like tabloid fluff, something invented by gossip writers to paint Meghan as either charmingly eager or hopelessly performative. After all, who practices a wave? Especially one that famously looks like someone trying to casually flick lint off their glove. But the rumor, as confirmed by multiple sources, including palace aides, close friends, and one unfortunate etiquette coach, was entirely real. It started, reportedly, as a matter of deep anxiety. Meghan, a seasoned actress, understood the power of body language. In her world, a single gesture could be interpreted 100 ways. But stepping into the monarchy was a different performance altogether. This wasn't just theater, it was living symbolism. And she wanted to get it right. The Queen's wave, often mistaken for a slight twist of the wrist or a gentle turn of the hand, was, in fact, an institution. Decades of refinement had distilled it into something perfectly non-committal. Not too enthusiastic, no jazz hands. Not too limp, no disinterest, and certainly no side-to-side flailing like someone hailing a taxi in Soho. It was regal muscle memory. So Meghan did what any perfectionist would do. She stood in front of a mirror and practiced, over and over, watching videos, studying news footage, asking staff for tips. "Is it more elbow or wrist?" she reportedly asked at one point. "Palm out or fingers together?" The answers varied. The Queen never explained the wave. She simply was the wave. An etiquette coach who worked with Meghan before her first major public walkabout confirmed that yes, time was set aside to focus on gestures, including the wave, handshake, and how to hold a clutch bag without looking like you were trying to remember where you left your phone. The most amusing part? Meghan didn't just try the wave in private. She reportedly had Harry watch her practice. Whether he offered notes or merely smiled politely is unclear, but the effort was unmistakable. She wanted to be ready, to perform not just as a royal, but as someone who had mastered its strangest, smallest nuances. And while critics spun the story as evidence of American ambition, the truth was far more mundane. She was nervous. And she practiced, like anyone would if their every hand movement was about to be watched by 2.4 billion people. In the end, the wave didn't save her from the storm that followed, but it did join the long, strange archive of royal truths. Those ridiculous little rumors that sound like parodies until they turn out to be completely real. And with that, we close the curtain on our collection. 33 royal oddities that once made people laugh, scoff, or outright roll their eyes. Only for history to quietly confirm them. Not scandals, not tragedies, just odd, absurd, wonderfully petty truths. Proof that even the most elevated bloodlines can't resist a little nonsense.